We were in a time where women were not only embracing, but they were fighting for their rights. And certainly domestic violence was an issue that affected women every day, all the time, and there wasn't anything happening for victims of domestic abuse.
Women's Advocates started as a collective. It was very grassroots led by women starting a phone service for women to call who had questions about divorce. Those folks quickly realized that at the time there were no places for women and children to go who were experiencing domestic violence.
Women's Advocates was founded in 1974 as the first domestic violence shelter in the country. Over the last 50 years, we have provided emergency shelter, but also paths to housing stability and violence prevention work in the community.
I think one of the biggest challenges that Women's Advocates faced in the beginning was actually not having a physical space. So what women found was that they were lending out spare bedrooms and couches so that victim survivors had a place to go and be safe.
We had an impact on women and children, and even though there's still so much violence, more probably now, the agency provides a critical service, and it's shelter plus many, many things.
An important change over the last 10 years or so with Women's Advocates is that the timing has really been right for the organization to start to shine a light on upstream prevention and then also building out the other end of the continuum of safety, which is safe, stable, and affordable housing.
I remember Sharon Rice Vaughn was quoted in 1974 saying that High on a Hill was a dream come true, which was Women's Advocates opening. Now we look 50 years later, and High on that Hill, Women's Advocates has changed not only domestic violence and the response to it across the nation, it has created a wave of change throughout the world.
Domestic violence is something that has been with us forever, but my true heartfelt wish is that we would get far enough in addressing this issue that Women's Advocates and all the other domestic violence organizations in this community would not be needed.